Thanks again to the Workers Council of Pittsburgh, the Japan American Society of Pennsylvania, for hosting this important discussion. I'd like to start off by giving our panelists an opportunity to give an opening statement before we launch into it. So without further ado, Ken, how about we start with you?
Yeah, thank you very much, John. I feel like being President Zelensky, speaking from the screen to everyone. But let me firstly thank the Japan American Society of Pennsylvania, World Affairs Council, and Sasakawa Peace Foundation for organizing this event. And I say all the time, but I regret that I cannot physically with you today at Carnegie Mellon today. In fact, I tried to seek a chance to travel to Pittsburgh, but since the international travel was not fully recovered, and especially the procedure upon returning to Japan, not the entry to the United States, but the returning to Japan were still quite uncertain. So I decided to be online. But nevertheless, I look forward to today's discussion with Zack and also John. As Russian invasion in Ukraine and ongoing crisis certainly has a global impact, and I'd like to start with how Japan responded to the Ukraine crisis. Then I also like to highlight what are the implications towards the geopolitics in Asia, which is the main subject that we're going to discuss today. Just a few hours ago, Ukraine President Zelensky made an online speech at the Japanese Diet that lasted for 15 minutes, which really covered the whole TV program in the 6 p.m. This evening. As he performed at the Congress and parliaments in the other countries like UK, Canada, the United States, and Germany, Zelensky also inspired this evening to the Diet members by thanking Japanese for taking decisive measures against the Russian invasion. It was quite, I think, thoughtful speech that really inspired all the listeners, but not as emotional as what he has done to Germany. There was no criticisms over Japan's relation with Russia, nor there were like overly kind of a request that the Japan should do more. But Zelensky emphasized that Japan has done a good deal of the condemning Russia, joining in the sanction, and then Zelensky expects Japan to keep it that way. So basically, that kind of quite a modest tone to be delivered to the Japanese audience was, I think, a carefully crafted, and it was very well received in Japan today. And as President Zelensky noted, Japan responded quite decisively this time by condemning Russia, setting the strict financial sanctions to Moscow, and also we have also set the export control, especially the semiconductor and those strategic goods to be exported to Russia. And most surprisingly, at least to me, we decided to transfer the defense equipment to Ukraine, the Japanese self-defense force equipment to Ukraine, which is modest one, because that only involves like things like a body armor and the helmets. But I think that transferring these equipments to the party who are directly involved in the conflict is something that Japan has not really has done in the post-war era. So I think that's also tells how remarkable since Japan has been taking such a decisive measures towards Russia, and such series of responses is especially important since Japan was placed in a unique position in the G7 regarding how we deal with Russia. And as you know, that we have long pursued our peace treaty with Moscow, especially during the Abe administration. So what you can find in the response, our response towards the 2014 Crimea, it was somewhat controversial because Japan took a rather nuanced position for not taking strict sanction measures to Russia, with a tacit expectation that our bilateral negotiation with Moscow was able to continue. But now I think Tokyo had a fundamental shift or the departure from our previous position during the Abe and the Suga administration. And that tells how significant the impact of this Russian invasion was. And I'll come back to this in a few moments. The thing that I like to discuss with Zack and audience today are, what are the implications to the geopolitics in Asia? And for this, I would like to lay out a couple of points. First, if I could get into the point, that is Taiwan. To begin with, many have argued how Taiwan resembles Ukraine situation, and versus many have also argued how irrelevant to compare Ukraine with Taiwan. And I think both arguments have persuasive reasons that we can really argue further. But I guess what Chinese leader have learned so far is how dangerous it is to underestimate opponent's capability, and how much it weighs a strategic cost if the swift invasion, as initially planned, was not really successful. So Xi Jinping might have cross-checked why Russia has failed so far, and he might have concluded that those intelligence gathering, decision-making processes derived from those limited circle would create the serious risk that is, uniquely associated with highly centralized authoritarian rules that Russia and China currently have. So that's number one. And the second aspect I also wish to draw John and Zack's attention is the question of the credibility of the US military engagement and also the NATO's response to the crisis. We have to admit that the deterrence has failed in Ukraine, and we have not seen the credible response measures to get this war to an end at this moment. You can always argue that Ukraine is not the treaty ally of NATO in the institutional sense. And also, we can also argue that direct military intervention may escalate the conflict to the broader scale, even involving the use of nuclear weapons. So I totally understand that the logic and what would be the fault line or the red line to be recognized. But now come to the question of Taiwan. The Taiwan is also not the ally of the United States. Then China has large-scale conventional capability and also the nuclear weapons. So things are no less escalatory than what Washington deal with Ukraine right now. So the question that we need to address in the US-Japan alliance context is to how the United States and Japan can defend Taiwan and engage in the war if needed against China, even under the possible nuclear threat. So I know this is a sensitive subject, but I would like policy makers to address more firmly on this matter. And especially those are very important in the alliance credibility context. So before I give a floor to Zack, the final point I would like to make is I think Japan's defense posture review that is currently underway until the end of this year. We are now revising the major strategy documents that involve national security strategy, national defense program guideline, and also the midterm defense plan altogether by the end of this year. And I also believe that it all depends on the end state of this Ukraine crisis. But given that the previous mode that we have with regard to Japan's policy towards Russia come to an end, and what we expect is that Russia may have no hesitation to pressure militarily in the Far East, including the installation of the potentially the new assets like INF range missiles and other maritime and air capability in the Far East. And I also expect the China-Russia strategic entanglement in the Western Pacific will also be enhanced. So what Japan needs to deal with is the multiple strategic front. Obviously, the China is at the core, but we see the more capable North Korea with nuclear missile capabilities in the West, and more assertive Russia in the North. So there are multiple strategic front that Japan need to allocate our resources, which is somewhat the departure from our previous assumption that we need to deal with Russia, keep on doing our, the peace treaty negotiation, with the expectation that the Russian strategic interests could be economically diversified, not through China, but also with Japan and other players, so that we expect not to, have an illusion of, making a wedge or try to, dilute the strategic interests between the two sides, but at least that we can, complicate the Chinese strategic calculation that whatever that the strategic interest they face with Asia cannot be always, dealt together with Russia because Russia has its own interest in Asia. But I think those assumption is currently gone. And I think that we really need to strategically pursue to deal with those multiple front. So that is the even more challenging strategic environment that we need to face, and that requires more resources to be allocated in our own defense and also the US-Japan alliance. So those are something that I wish to make before all the discussion begins. So I'll leave it to, I pass the floor to Zach. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, it's wonderful to be here and fantastic to be alongside my old friend Ken, who I haven't seen in person in too long, so it's nice to see him virtually. And John, we went to grad school together, so it's wonderful to see you as well. And thanks to the World Affairs Council and the Japan American Society for putting this on. When I found out that I was going to be coming up here, I was texting my closest friend from Pittsburgh, who's a fanatical Steelers fan, and asking what I have to do when I come here. And she texted back, and she's at the White House now in a pretty senior Asia job. And she said, "I'm sorry, I'll just send you some quick stuff. I'm on a plane to Tokyo." And I think that for me was a good reminder about how deep the US-Japan relationship is. This isn't somebody who handles the US-Japan alliance, right? And so the question that people might ask is, why would someone at the White House right now, when there's a lot going on in the world, be flying to Tokyo if they don't manage the US-Japan relationship? And I think, as Ken was saying, the reason in my mind is because you can make a really strong case that in many ways, Japan is America's most important ally. And I know that's not how a lot of Americans think about the world, right? When we think about our key allies, I think a lot of people would say, well, you have this special relationship with the United Kingdom, you have an alliance with Australia in which we've fought together alongside each other in every conflict for 100 years. You've got the NATO alliance more broadly, which is absolutely critical right now. But I think when you look at the world and the competition that we're in between democracies and autocracies, and in particular now between Russia and China and much of the other advanced economies of the world, what you see is that Japan is in many ways this central core of 4 different emerging coalitions. And we're going to talk about one of those a lot today, which is the Geostrategic Coalition, really, which is about security issues in my mind. And if you think about security issues, I think Japan has to be right at the core. Why? Because for the United States, Asia is the most important region of the world increasingly. It's where a huge portion of the world lives, where a huge portion of economic growth is. It's home to most of the world's nuclear powers, and increasingly more and more of our military. And in Asia, Japan is our #1 ally. right? It is our most capable ally in our most important region. So geostrategically, Japan is at the core. Then you can think about an economic coalition, which I think we're trying to build. And again, who's at the core of that? Japan, right? It's the world's #3 economy. It's absolutely critical in a whole bunch of areas, and the cooperation we've seen just the last few weeks on economic sanctions has been tremendously important. So economically, Japan is again right at the core. Another coalition I think we have to build is on technology. And Japan, again, a leading technology player, right? And there are a handful of countries around the world that are absolutely critical on technology issues, but on everything from microprocessors to biomedical advances, Japan is at the forefront. And then finally, we have what I would call sort of global governance issues. And this is the area where I think a lot of people would say maybe Japan hasn't been at the forefront in the past. Japan has sometimes been quiet about calling out human rights abuses. It has sometimes sort of wanted to play a little bit of a backseat role in certain cases. But I think what we've seen the last decade is Japan really stepping up, and Japan acknowledging that it has to make what Prime Minister Abe said, a more proactive approach to the world. And we see this with Russia, right? Where Japan is stepping up and saying, no, there are certain rules and norms, and we're going to follow those, and we're going to stand up for them, even if it's costly to Japan. And just the last few days, the Russian government has tried to put some pressure on Japan and their disputed northern territory. And basically what we're seeing from Japan is that Tokyo is willing to accept some costs to stand up for this global governance system that we've created. So, when I sort of ask myself, why is it that, we're here talking about Japan and Pittsburgh, I think the answer for me is, we talk a lot about a whole bunch of other countries when, we travel out from Washington to the rest of the country, but usually those discussions have to do with China or Russia or Ukraine right now. But at the end of the day, a lot of the hard work of doing foreign policy is about building alliances or partnerships. And in each of those 4 areas, on geostrategy, on economics, on technology, and on governance, Japan is right at the core of the coalitions we have to build. And it's hard to imagine this, but there aren't really any other countries that I think you could say that about, right? We have some really close allies in Europe, but a lot of them aren't such key technology players, and some of them aren't that huge economically. But Japan, on each one of those areas, geostrategy, economics, technology, and governance issues, is a leader. And that means that it's not just a leader for how we think about those individual areas, but it's a leader for how the US needs to think about engaging the world on these issues and prioritizing among these areas. So I'm really happy to get a chance to be here and have this discussion with all of you, and always to be alongside Ken and John. So I'll hand it back to you, John.
Excellent. Thanks, Ken and Zach. So there's a whole list of questions, and in a few minutes, we'll open it up to the audience as well. I maybe wanted to start with something that's near and dear to my heart related to this, is to think about what is the role of democracy, or should the role of democracy, building an alliance for democracy. So those of you who don't know, among the many hats that Zack wears, is sort of co-director of this Alliance for Securing Democracy for German. I'm wondering, so Japan, of course, one of the most democratic countries in the region, if you look at any sort of these measures, like varieties of democracy or Freedom House and so on, as well as South Korea, another US ally, Australia, New Zealand, of course. And then there's, of course, in the context of the Quad Alliance, there's India, which in recent years, like the United States, maybe has had its own struggles, say with democratic erosion and backsliding. And so I'm wondering, especially so in the context of this Ukraine invasion, everything that's going on, the Biden administration trying to host these summit of democracies, sort of what, should the US and Japan really be trying to work to forge, what does it mean to forge an alliance of democracies to sort of make Asia safe for democracy, so to speak? Maybe I'll start with you, Zach, but also Ken, if you want to chime in as well.
I think this is one of the central questions, and you've been a leader on this issue, so interested in your thoughts as well. So I think democracy is sometimes a tough issue in Asia, right? So John just mentioned we had this summit for democracy in December, and we talk a lot about how important it is for the United States to engage with partners in Asia all across the region. There are 10 members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is in many ways sort of, people would say, the central core of Asia. And yet only 3 of those members were invited to the Summit for Democracy, which was the Biden administration sort of admitting that, right, 70% of the countries in the most important part of the most important region to us are not democratic. And so you do get some people who say, well, maybe the US shouldn't talk so much about democracy, right? This is an awkward fit in many of the places that we engage. And who is the United States to talk about democracy after January 6th? And I understand those critiques, but I think part of the challenge for American policymakers is that there are other times where democracy really matters, right? Go to Europe and, I will tell you, before the Ukraine crisis, trying to get Europeans to talk about our shared interests and pushing back against Russia was pretty tough, right? What Europeans would often want to talk about was shared values, values about democracy, about the rule of law, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think the hard thing for the United States is in different regions, we have to talk about values and interests differently. So when we're in Europe, we're going to have to talk about values issues. That's something that really resonates. When we're in Asia, we have to talk more about interests a lot of the time. And there's certain countries like Japan where we can talk about both values and interests, and that's very easy and comfortable. But I think we have to be able to do both. And I think for me, this comes back to those 4 coalitions I was saying. The Geostrategic Coalition, it's not really so much about the core values, it's about shared interests, right? So India, even though it has been engaged in some democratic backsliding, it has a lot of shared interests with the United States, especially when it comes to China. And so for a country like India, we're going to have to talk a lot about our shared interests. For a country like Germany, until a few weeks ago, I think shared values were really the thing that opened the door for us in Germany, right? So yes, there is some danger in talking too much about democracy. But the final thing I'll say is that I think increasingly we're seeing a bit of a divide between the autocracies and the democracies. And it's not just what Vladimir Putin has done by invading Ukraine. It's also what China has done by basically choosing to back Russia in this endeavor. And about a year and a half ago, a bipartisan group of us came together and wrote a big report on the role of values and democracy in American strategy. And at the time, a lot of people were saying, look, we shouldn't push Russia and China together by talking too much about democracy. Maybe we can split them apart. But then about 2 months ago, Russia and China announced that they now have a no limits partnership, right? And in fact, despite the fact that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a terrible strategic problem for China, Xi Jinping is basically standing with Putin against most of the rest of the developed world. And I think we're seeing the world therefore sort of divide into these blocks, right? An increasingly democratic bloc led by Japan, Korea, Australia, Taiwan, in Asia and most of Europe and the United States and Canada. And then an autocratic bloc, which is really China and Russia. And, as much as I think some of us were hoping to avoid that, I think that's where we're headed, unfortunately. And so we're going to have to, I think, deal with that reality, whether it makes some of our friends in Asia a little uncomfortable to talk about democracy or not.
Ken, did you maybe want to jump in here?
Sure. I think I agree with Zack that the Asia has the nuances over apprehension of the democracy as the governance to be adopted in each country. But back in 80s, that we had a basic premise that sound economic growth will eventually lead into the plural democracy. that has been exemplified by the Philippines and Korea in 1980s, Taiwan in 1990s, and also Indonesia in 2000. So basically, that the direction that we had up until 2000 was a kind of a parallel perspectives that the economic engagement and also the enlargement policy of the achieving the plural democratic governance can really, pursued in tandem. But something that happened, since 2000 is, as Zack mentioned, that there has been the series of the democracy backsliding or the democracy in decline that you can find even in the close allies and partners of the United States. For example, in Thailand, where I lived, a couple of months, that there has been a series of coups that still, entangle in the Thai politics for long years, and the Philippines, also the U.S. allies in Southeast Asia, has been, having a track record of the decline of the civil liberty issues and the way that the government can handle the judiciary issues, especially under the Duterte administration. And you can find other examples like Myanmar and even the country like Singapore, where you cannot really expect the full-fledged kind of the people's freedom inside your society. So what you can really tell is quite a the huge dilemma that the South Asia are still gaining the profits from the economic growth in the society, and we can see the developing of the middle class people in those society, which is in the textbook says that if middle class grows, there will be the pluralization of the society. Diversification of those interests can only be to be served by the democratic governance. But those premises are not being materialized in the society that you can see in Asia, but even beyond, like a Turkey, African country, Middle East, and so on. So those are the very difficult situation for the democracy as of today. And I basically, agree with Dax that basically those ideological values, agenda is quite a fundamental part of the coalition building. What kind of value we want to pursue at the end is the fundamental issue that this, that the alliance and those strategic partners should pursue. But at the same time, if you try to draw the line between authoritarian states and the democracy, you will lose lots of the interface, especially those transitional states, and how we can really engage strategically into those regions. If we try to choose, for example, that we cannot engage deeply towards the Vietnam, Vietnam is basically an authoritarian state, but it has a strategic potential to become a partner with Japan and also with the United States. If the value comes to first, I think we'll miss the opportunity how to engage the Vietnam. And I think those other countries may try to take the maximum opportunity for for us not be able to engage fully with those transitional states. So I think what we also need to pursue is somewhat, as Zack mentioned, that the interest-based orientation of how we can really make a coalition, and those could be the very important perspective, especially that the global decline of democracy is now underway.
Thanks, Ken. Well, I think we could spend the whole time talking about that. There's a lot of ground to cover. I'll maybe throw one more question out before opening our face to the audience. And so maybe shifting to thinking more on economic statecraft, so the geostrategic implications of economic integration in Asia. Of course, after the Trump administration sort of backed out of TPP and sort of Japan found itself in a leadership position with the CPTPP, right, the Trans-Pacific Partnership follow on. Should the US get back in? China's, of course, made its own bid. Maybe, Ken, can you start where do you sort of see the role of economic integration in all this?
Yeah, I think we today's title is a geostrategy, but I think we also have to look at another important concept. It's called the geoeconomics, because economic grouping and also the integration is the fundamental issue in creating the regional order. Whenever the United States try to pursue its concept of the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, that also involves, as Zack mentioned, that not only the geostrategic perspective, but all the economic technologies and also the governance issue to be involved. So one of those economic kind of indicators that we can see is obviously that the figure you can find from the trade and investments, and also the institutional aspects that which country that you have a formal kind of economic alliance or economic cooperation schemes with them, with FTA, investment agreements, and all the others. And I think you can find a multiple kind of lining up of those layers of structures. You have a WTO, IMF at the global center, but in the region, you can see the APEC as the more inclusive, the framework for economic cooperation. But if you want to truly look into the more meaningful measures for boosting the trade and investment relations, including the harmonization of the standards, we do have CPTPP, and I still regret that the United States withdrew from the TPP negotiation, and still I think the Japanese government is seeking a chance that the United States will in the near future that they will relook to this opportunity to come back to the TPP once again. But those are a very important, I think, standardization of the economic order in Asia, and especially that has become an important leverage for the future applicants to the TPP. Currently, that the UK is applying for the TPP. And what surprises us that now China, raised a hand together with Taiwan, not together, but simultaneously with Taiwan, and also interesting that Ecuador is also tried to be part of it. So by having those kind of high standard, the TPP, we can also try to leverage to pressure China to make them have a more drastic internal reform to become a TPP member. Those are, I think, closely in line with United States compiling, requests and frustration towards the Chinese economic system. But by using those TPP, I think application procedures, those can also be reflected to how we can really jointly try to pressure China to conduct its own domestic economic reform. And to the other side, I think China is also expanding its own ecosystem in their favor, using their concept of the Belt and Road initiative for some time. And that not only involve their financing to the infrastructures in wider Asia and the Eurasian continents, but also they are now exporting its own digital technologies, digital platform, e-commerce system, and government surveillance mechanisms, and all these. So I think it is the competition of standards for many things. Sometimes it can overlap with each other. For example, Belt and Road initiative type of finance can also be co-financed together with World Bank and Asia Development all together. That is creating the net benefits for the recipients. But for many examples that we also have a very different standards of infrastructure investments, which I think China will create some I think so-called debt trap kind of initiatives. You can find some projects in the Sri Lanka and a couple of cases that Chinese spend a lot of money into those infrastructure projects, which exceed the capacity to return by those recipient governments. Eventually, that will create the very bad standards in the investment scheme. So if we could really compete with the most sustainable quality investment structures, sometimes it can be strategically employed. Those are, I think, very important way how we can really compete in the geostrategic domain vis-a-vis China. Those are something that I wish to offer.
Thanks. I'll just build on what Jen said, and I think unfortunately, the United States hasn't had an economic strategy in Asia for at least 5 years. And this is where sometimes your allies are important, not just for cooperating when you're both making progress, but sometimes when you fall behind. And the United States decided to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that was Donald Trump's 3rd day in office. But let's be honest, Hillary Clinton had said that she was going to do the same after having pushed for the Trans-Pacific Partnership when she was Secretary of State. And now we have the Biden administration, which unfortunately has basically adopted the same policy, despite the fact that Joe Biden, when he was vice president, was pushing very hard for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, it's a little strange because if you look at polling data, you would be probably quite surprised to find out that trade became much more popular among Americans under Donald Trump. Not just among Democrats, actually more popular among Republicans while Donald Trump was attacking trade. And yet we find ourselves in this strange position where if you go to Washington right now and try and talk about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, you'll find almost no member of Congress who's willing to stand up and say, oh, this is a great idea. But in Asia, what you hear from Ken and just about anybody in the region, when you say, well, what's the most important thing for the United States to do? They'll say economic engagement, right? What they want is trade and investment from the United States. They want the United States to stand up and say, okay, here's a high standards trade agreement, right? In particular, because there are concerns about what China is doing in a whole bunch of areas. Intellectual property theft, huge subsidies to state enterprises. I could go on down the line, but the basic lesson is the United States is being asked by many Asian friends to be more economically engaged, and we just haven't been able to do that. And I think this is where friends like Japan have been absolutely critical, because there's sometimes when we sort of fall behind, and Japan has really stepped up. It looked for a while like the Trans-Pacific Partnership might just go away, and instead Japan stepped up and it continued the partnership and it passed it without the United States being involved. But now we do face, in my view, a pretty difficult choice, which is that we're now in a position where China is part of a major trade deal called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. We pulled out of the trade deal that we had been promoting in Asia, TPP. And now the Chinese are trying to enter the new version of TPP, the CPTPP, as Ken was saying. And the reality is we could find ourselves in a strange position where the United States is basically not in any of the 2 major trade deals in the region, and China is in both. I think that would be incredibly damaging. So, in my view, this is the one area of American strategy in Asia where we're the furthest behind and we don't seem to have any answers. And Japan is hopefully trying to pull us in the right direction, but I think we need some new thinking, particularly in Washington, about this issue.
Well, I'd officially like to open it up for Q&A. Just first, if you are on joining us virtually, you can drop a question into the chat feature on Zoom. I'll get to those as well to the extent I can, but we can start off in the room, and I see you're eager, so why don't
Yes. Okay. I was once on the board for the World Affairs Council. I have been in the United Nations for years because of an organization called Global Solutions. I just want to give a little background. As far as Japan, one of my best friends was Dr. Glenn Sherman, who created the best laser lenses in the world and lived in Del Mar, right north of San Diego. He got the contract from the United States military to deal with that, but his other person was Japan, because the Japanese have always chosen things of high quality. My husband dealt with the World Trade Center problems. He was one of the scientists that help deal with settling a lot of the economic situations, dealing with damages done to buildings around the World Trade Center. So I don't want to go on and on, but what brought me to thinking all of this is many years ago, I was at a luncheon and a young man sat down beside me. He was 35 years old and he was Gorbachev's economic advisor. Okay. And he started to talk to me. No one had come yet. And he said, I have to tell you about Russia. And he continued to tell me a lot about it. And right before COVID, I had a conversation with our ambassador from the United States to Russia. And they all told me that Russia was controlled by 35-year-old economic majors. And then one of the university professors invited me to another party anyway. And there was an old man sitting there by the elevator and he turned around and talked to me and I said, you're Russian? And he said, yes, but he knew another Russia where he'd been tortured and things had happened. And when I said, what about the 35-year-old economic majors? He said, you were talking to the head of the KGB. Now, because of all my years and my daughter did date Uma Tennessee. Uma Tennessee's father was head of the United Nations Division on Population Control. And as a result, Uma's father was best friends with the president of Turkey. They met in college at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So over the years, I have met a lot of people and seen a lot of things. I would like to know if any of you are aware of P.W. Singer, S-I-N-G-E-R. I've met Peter and I wanted to meet him because he has written the best book on warfare and cybersecurity. And what I taught at a university for a while, and the provost at Pitt pretty much helped put the European, Alberta Sabraja was a good friend of mine for years. Our children were the same age, and she put the European Union together, and she invited me to every meeting they had when they were forming different sections. So look at the world. The world is very complex. I was not in politics at that time. I go all the way to Washington. And so you're talking about variables on every different level that have an impact. You're talking about some, not all. And in the World Affairs Council, we had a person many years ago that I stayed afterwards when he had people coming out of Iraq talking to us, people coming out of Kosovo. He knew what was going on the ground. So I don't have the same view. I don't judge nations. You can't do that or you can't see the system. And there is a system. So to me, the system is looking back 500 years at the nations who rise and fall and controlling a lot of part of the world. And if you look at China, they have been in that position about 3 times. It's an 8,000-year-old civilization. And I used to wonder years ago, like 40 years ago, there's China, and there it sits. And are we going to have something again? And we do. And Sky Forrester, I don't know if you know Sky, I did not know it, but he was the key person to advise NATO. He was in charge of NATO and he didn't tell me. He was also head of security at Oxford University and Harvard. So Sky and I used to talk about a lot of things. And after you study a lot for a while, you could see exactly what's going on. And in fact, where you're trying to do something. And the idea of democracy is something, of course, the Greeks had to some extent, of people having some power in their own countries. But for the most part, you have a world always controlled by a dictator. Depends on if he's good or bad. And China and countries, what you have to look is the culture of the country. And I don't think you can change the culture of a country very well. But when the last time I saw Sky, he turned and looked at me and he said, Nancy, I'm leaving Pittsburgh, but it's all about the money. And every powerful man, I know Robert Kennedy Jr., We were talking about the Hudson River thing he did. Every powerful person I've ever met will look at me at the end and say it's all about the money. And it is, okay? And so what I see for Japan is that the Japanese, to me, are incredibly outstanding in that when they make a car and there's something wrong with it, they fix it. Because I know somebody who's in charge of that worldwide about paints. I mean, I think it's the only country in the world. We don't. Americans don't fix it. They just keep making it and hope people buy it and advertise. And what I see is it's all about the money. And over the years, what has happened is the United States between 1950 and up to maybe the late 60s was at its peak. And then it started going down. And China, nobody noticed because, you know, they didn't have infrastructure. And I know a lot of the companies that went over there from America, the big companies, heads of them, and then built buildings there. PPG did that first. And China is now the money.
The question, ma'am?
So the question is, I don't think the United States is any longer the world power because of that thing. I think China is because of the number
This is a
of,
good question,
right.
but I think so part of my dissertation is on this exact
Right.
question. So I think you're right that absolutely, you know, there's a huge change in power. And if you look back at the US, especially after World War II, right? The US is a huge portion of global domestic product after World War II. We were in an incredibly lucky position. The reality is that, you know, if you go back 3 or 4 decades and you look at China and how big it was economically, it was tiny, right? And I don't think anyone would argue that that is the way that we thought the world was going to stay, right? In many ways, you know, the Chinese economy was incredibly depressed from basically, call it 1800, right, to 1960, 70, at least 1975, when Deng Xiaoping starts putting in some major changes in China. But I think the challenge for us now is, and this builds on some of what you were saying. So the United States, we're not as powerful as we used to be, right? And it's hard to accept that as Americans, right? You know, it's always nice to be a rising power and to know you're a rising power. It's really hard to recognize that you're declining in relative terms compared to some of your competitors. But I think at the end of the day, that doesn't mean that we don't have a tremendous amount of wealth and influence that we can use. And for example, you know, if you look at total wealth held by households in the United States, it's tremendous compared to any other country in the world, right? We have a huge amount of built up wealth, and that gives us some huge advantages. And so the question in my mind is, you know, along these lines, right? The US can't do everything on its own that it used to be able to do, right? After World War II, we could remake the global system, right? So, you know, I work at an institution that's affiliated with the Marshall Fund. Well, you know, it's hard to believe this, but in 1947, 48, the United States spent 5% of its total production on giving it through the Marshall Fund to foreign countries, right? So this is bigger than Build Back Better, right? And we did this every year for several years, right? We're not in the position to do that anymore. And but what we are in a position to do, I think, is to work with key allies like Japan to bring them together to do hard things, right? And I think that's where that's what the United States has to do now, which means we can't be the same unilateral power that we used to be, right? And that's hard. That means we've got to work a lot more closely with allies and partners, and we're going to have to rely on them to do certain things. And I think we're seeing this right now with the Ukraine crisis, right? That yes, the United States can do some things, but often we're really dependent on our allies in particular stepping up. And then the question is, how do we make and convince our allies to step up and to work with us closely? I think the Russia challenge now is doing that for Europe. But the question, and maybe this is a good segue to Ken, is how do we get our Asian allies to do more also, right? And I think some of them are absolutely stepping up. I think, as I said, Japan, Korea are playing really important roles, but we don't have that kind of same developed infrastructure in Asia that we have in Europe. I think that's what we really need to build. I don't know, Ken, if you want to build on that.
Sure. The question of decline of the United States periodically come and go, and we've got to deal with those sober assessment of the U.S. power in the world. And by looking at the GDP growth, probably sometime in the late 2020s, China may overtake the sheer size of the GDP of the United States for some time. But something that we also need to look at is that there are many economic think tanks and the institutions are, making those future studies that in 2030s, that China will also have to deal with their own domestic problems. They have to allocate more resources to the pensions and distributions. That's what Xi Jinping needs to address about the common prosperity issues, because they need to really reallocate those resources, so that those growth model needs to be transformed drastically in 2030s, and then China will deal with its own aging society. Meanwhile, United States, I think innovation continues to be there, and many of those institutions also try to predict that the United States will retake over China in 2040s. So the United States may become a number two, but the number two for probably for 1 or 2 decades, and the United States will come back again. So I think those kind of expectation is a very important bet for all the allies, what we can really achieve together with the United States. But meanwhile, we also have to struggle and survive during the difficult years in 2020s and 30s. And this is why the allies needs to do, take more responsibility on our end in terms of the defense capabilities and also the economic engagement, and including those older building, because sometimes there has been a stereotype in China and Russia that Japan is only kind of junior partner of the United States, and what Japan decides is something in line with the United States. But something you can see in the past is quite different, including, for example, that Zack kindly mentioned about the CPTPP. TPP is dead as the original style because the United States withdrew, but Japan tried to perceive that the TP standards still survive, and that we want to continue the process by having the framework even without the United States, with expectation that the United States will come back. So those are, I think, very important role to be played by the allies. So allies has its own, the interest and capabilities to be addressed somewhere United States cannot really handle solely by its own self. But together, we can really combine those different sets of a portfolio together. And then that net results of those alliance capability will be even stronger. And I think those are the, important logic that the alliance needs to pursue.
Okay, why don't we take 2 questions at a time and do the questions, and then we'll maybe you'll be able to respond in turn. So first,
yes, good morning to you. I'd like to know if you would care to comment on the outcome of the South Korean elections and its effects on East Asia, especially in relationship to Japan and North Korea.
Why don't we take another question, and then we'll just for the sake of efficiency.
Okay, so my question is hydrocarbon energy question. Japan, I guess this is a question for more kind of Ken, but I mean, whoever wants to answer, just pitch in. Japan has pretty much one of the world's, if not the world's, most insecure, longest hydrocarbon supply chain. Talking about the Middle East. I think the whole question of whether the US is falling and China is rising, I think that question is a lot less relevant than people think. I think the question that is the statement, I guess the idea that is more prevalent is the US is becoming more lethargic and we just kind of don't care. As the 9/11 generation comes up, we're just going to want less and less to do with the world. Young people don't want anything to do with the Middle East. We don't want anything to do with most of the world. So I guess that kind of question comes into what plans does Japan have for energy diversification outside of green energy? Because from my own studies, I just can't see green picking up the slack if oil just gets cut off to Japan.
May I start?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for those two important questions. First on Korea, just a couple of days ago that we had a Korea election, and most fortunately for us, at least from the Tokyo's perspective, the conservative Yoon candidate Yoon have won the election. And now they are in the transition periods to form the new government in Korea. And what do we expect is that we do currently face with the opportunity to reset the Japan-Korea relationship that we have, had a geopolitics or really, diluted the direction that we are supposed to pursue as a strategic partner. But given that the current status of the political relationship in Japan-Korea is, I think, in the very bottom, with lack of trust in managing the history recognition issues, and also over the territorial rights in the Sea of Japan. By the way, that Korea never called the Sea of Japan, they call the East Sea. But we do have a lot, the plenty of problem bilateral. But in the wider strategic context, you have the issue of North Korea. North Korea is now developing its own capability on the nuclear weapons and the missiles. And we also need to bear the burden, the responsibility for wider regional order issues. So I think it is a very important timing that Japan and Korea will sit together with the United States to pursue Japan, Korea, US trilateral strategic coordination at the earliest possible, before any kind of domestic election issue may fall out. Overshadow the bilateral relationship. So I think that those kind of occasion should be earlier the better. And I expect that the President Biden will seek the opportunity to come to Japan and Korea to seek for the chance to organize those trilateral summit or the ministerial meeting to set up the agenda for the upcoming years, how we can really realign together, both on the geostrategic and also that there are plenty of economic agenda that the three countries need to pursue. So I think this is a very good timing, but the timing could be missed, if you leave those situations for a couple of months. So those are, I think, something that I wish to stress here. On the energy diversification, I'm not really specialized in those fields, but let me offer my general perspective. I guess Japan is energy, very vulnerable in the energy consumption. Those dynamics, especially Japan is not the energy producing countries. So something that we can really pursue is to, as you can see, that the diversification of the energy sources, especially on the oil, natural gas, LNG, and also renewable technologies. And since the earthquake in 2011 and the Fukushima Daiichi plan issue has still lingers as the issue that we have been very slow and the delayed process of the reactivation of the many of those domestic nuclear power plants. The several has been working right now, and so it also creates our vulnerability of energy supply in this issue. So I think that we are very encouraged to expand those economical relation with those Middle Eastern country. That's what why the Foreign Minister Hayashi has been actively dealing with the LNG supply, especially when the Russian resources will be very much affected by this Ukraine crisis. And we also expect that the shale revolution in the United States and that those extra capacity that the United States can really fill the gap with those demands for the rest of Asia. And also Canada is also trying to pursue those new developments on this energy exports. And so those kind of diversification, I think North American components have become strategically very important for the country like Japan and also Korea.
Yeah, I'll just build on what Ken said. So, I think when it comes to Korea, we're going to see a really substantial change over the next few years. And in a lot of ways, I think a very positive one for the United States. And the new conservative government in Korea, led by President Moon, is going to be part of this. But I think it started even over the last year under his predecessor. There was a joint statement that President Moon made when he visited President Biden in Washington last May. And it, in my mind, began to shift the US-South Korea relationship from one that really focused on the Korean Peninsula and on North Korea, number one, to a relationship that's much more broad. And in many ways, I think that's a very important shift for the United States. Just like we need Japan to be a leader in all these other areas, we need Korea to also be a leader in these areas. And so the statement that Biden and Moon made together, the biggest part of it wasn't about North Korea. It was about technology supply chain issues and working together on that. And I think that's really critical. And we've now seen Korea step up on sanctions on Russia. They're even sometimes mentioning Taiwan in bilateral statements, which is a big surprise for many of us. This was sort of a third rail for Korea for a long time. And I think the Yoon government is determined to think of South Korea's role, not just as dealing with the North Korea challenge, but as a much larger regional and global role. And to do that, the South Korea-Japan relationship has to get better. That's just the reality. And I know that that's tricky in both capitals, but I agree 100% with Ken. President Biden is supposed to go to Asia. We don't know exactly where he's going, but he has to go to Japan. He's probably going to go to Korea, maybe Australia, and one other place. I would not be shocked if Biden meets with both the Japanese and the Korean leaders, not just separately, but maybe even together on that trip. That would be a huge change. There's nothing to announce yet, of course, but I think that is entirely possible now. A year ago, it would have been completely impossible to imagine something like that happening. So I think we could be nearing a breakthrough. It won't solve the existing problems, but it will dampen them enough that we can focus on the issues we have to get down to. And then just a quick word on what I think is a really important question, which is like, what do younger Americans care about, right? I teach at a couple of different universities, and my students, and I'm sure you see this at CMU here, have in some cases really different views about what the US should be doing in the world, right? One thing that I hear pretty frequently from my students, and I think you've seen this from the past 2 US administrations, is they just don't think the Middle East is someplace the US should be putting a lot of energy. I think there are a lot of reasons for that. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan seem to have been pretty costly and didn't have that much return. It seems like a lot of our partners in the Middle East are not particularly reliable, and most of them are not democratic. And then I think there's this deeper issue which goes to energy, as you stated, right? Which is, if the US is producing more energy than we consume, then it does undermine the fundamental reason that the US became so deeply invested in the Middle East in the first place, right? So if you think about what happened in the early 20th century, the argument that Americans were making was, we have to care about Europe because it's an industrial center. We have to care about Asia because it's an industrial center. We have to care about the Middle East because there's oil there. But now that the US is one of the leading producers in the world of oil and gas. And oh, by the way, now that the price of oil and gas are skyrocketing, we're going to see even more shale coming out of the US. I think there's going to be a readjustment here. And you saw it from Trump. Trump clearly didn't believe that the US should be deeply invested in the Middle East. You see this pretty clearly from Biden. They're messaging quite clearly that they're not quite sure what they want to do in Europe and Asia on the military side, probably some increases. And where are those forces going to come from? They're going to come from the Middle East. So I think little by little, we're seeing this instinct among younger Americans translate into actual policy changes. And I think actually the time we may see some big changes are in the next couple of weeks. So the president's budget is supposed to come out Friday. That usually comes with a national defense strategy. That national defense strategy usually says how the US is going to adjust its forces globally a little bit. And the one thing that Biden's team has made clear is that the big change they want to make is to decrease some of the presence in the Middle East. So I think this is definitely an area to watch. And I think it's all driven in part by perceptions of, sort of failed wars and the changing energy landscape globally.
First, about the United States. New York Times Magazine had a special issue today about where does American democracy goes. And one of the conclusions is multiracial democracy is a very difficult, and that seems to affect a lot of things. Okay, so another two terms I was impressed is liberal internationalist, illiberal nationalist. It seems to be that illiberal nationalists are gaining power. Now that's not just my observation. One question related to today's talk is about why don't we pay more attention to India, where the economy is growing well right now, and we need India to counter any China or Russia, so on so in Asia. Why don't we pay more attention and try to make India more close ally?
Yeah. Why don't we gather a few questions? This is probably gonna be our last round of questions, actually. So, if there anyone wants to say in the back, yeah, sure.
I know that especially in East Asia, there's a big problem with aging and depopulation. And I've even heard that in the United States, the natural born population is already starting to decline or stagnate. Do you guys see immigration as sort of a strategic, maybe not misfire, but place to look at in East Asian democracies to maybe counteract the trend or the baked-in idea that these democracies are waning? It's really autocracies that are on the rise. Do you think that has some part of it?
One more. I thought I saw another.
Yeah. I just, from what I've studied of American history, complete isolationism for the United States has failed miserably over the centuries and the decades. Is the real issue maintaining autonomy, but at the same time trying to keep a balance and some security by teaming up with other countries, whether they're not entirely democratic, but still there's an advantage to helping those countries, those other types of governments, maintain some stability and some trade agreements.
Related to both of those questions, that there was a question on the Zoom about January 6th and the Democratic backsliding.
Maybe I'll take that first because it's easier for an American to critique ourselves than so I think at the core of all these questions, there's sort of this reality, right? That for a lot of us that study international relations, we always think of the threats as coming from abroad. But I think it's been a good reminder that the problems we have here at home are really serious, right? And we can't ignore them. And some of this is because the US is a remarkably secure country, right? So the famous saying is that the United States is surrounded by fish and friends. And that's true, right? I mean, we can talk about China rising and it absolutely is, but China is a country with like 14 neighbors. It's got border disputes with 7 of them. A bunch of those neighbors have nuclear weapons, and a lot of them don't have any particular, longstanding friendly relationship with China. And if anything, the relationships are getting worse, right? Talk about India, right? Huge player, going to be far more populous than China will be given the demographic challenges in China. Talk about Japan, where there is a territorial dispute, and it's still the world's 3rd largest economy. And so it's easy here in the United States, I think, often to look at the world and forget how secure we are just by the nature of our geography and the fact that we have good relationships with our 2 closest neighbors, right? Canada and Mexico. And so look, I'm sort of a partisan on the immigration issue. My wife is an immigration attorney. I think immigration is a good thing. I think a lot of Asian countries, especially the more advanced ones, are struggling in part because they don't attract immigrants. And as economies grow more rich, people tend to have fewer children, right? And this is part of the challenge in Japan and Korea and Taiwan. We're seeing this even in China now, right? Where in part because of the one-child policy, China is having a terrible, terrible problem getting people to have more children. And the demographic issues that Ken's mentioning are going to be incredibly severe, right? And if you look at the numbers that are just out the last few weeks from China, it's always hard to trust some of the data coming out of the party. But the demographic numbers are just shockingly terrible, right? It's the combination of COVID, the one China policy, a whole range of things. And yet here in the United States, we have millions of people that want to come here. And I think, there's some real benefits to that, but it does raise this question about a multicultural society and how democracies handle this. And there's a lot of research that says, look, in many ways, the democracies that have it the easiest are the ones that are not multicultural. And I'm not suggesting that that means that we shouldn't be multicultural, right? I'm just saying, right, like often you'll hear people say, oh, the Nordic countries, they do everything better than us. Well, that is true in part because there's a shared history in the Nordic countries that goes back in some cases for centuries, right? And the populations are much more similar, and they don't have a lot of the fractures that we're seeing in parts of Europe and the United States. But I think we have to be incredibly careful to make the argument that actually multiculturalism is part of what has always made America strong. And, I think this is something that, look, I work at the American Enterprise Institute, which is a moderate conservative place. I think you hear very different views among Republicans and among people that lean towards the right about immigration and its values. But from my standpoint, I think this is something that we have to embrace. And it's part of what has always made America strong, right? Japan has a lot of problems, one of which is that it has a hard time getting younger workers in who are needed to do things like elder care, right? The United States has a pathway of people that want to come here and do these kinds of jobs that we need done that are really important and that add to our society. But I do think, and this is the final thing I'll say, that this connects back a bit to January 6th. And I think January 6th was a tremendously damaging day for the United States. I don't think the Republican Party has dealt with this properly. And I think, to be very direct, that the Republican Party has to come to terms with this. It's not that the Republican Party can't win elections without dealing with the reality of what happened on January 6th. But I think the reality is that our friends around the world are watching this, right? And I can't tell you how often people from other countries say to me, you co-direct a group called the Alliance for Securing Democracy, but it doesn't seem like your democracy is doing that well, right? And I don't have good answers for that. And so I think this is something that we've really got to come to terms with. And I do think, unfortunately, it has an ethnic dimension to it. And this is part of what, what we as a country have to deal with. And I don't think we can just sweep it under the rug. So I know that's not a Japan focused point, but I do think this is a question that, when I talk to friends from Japan, I hear it quite often. So I'm glad that someone raised it.
And last but not least, maybe some.
Sure. Let me first to take about the issue of India. India is the country with a huge population, multi-ethnic. The local languages are plenty. They struggle to unify its state model, but it's a struggling democracy from the early stage of the economic development, highly respected and high potential to be partner with Western democracies as well. And recently, we have stepped up our cooperation under the scheme of so-called Quad cooperation that involves the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. 10 to 15 years ago, those kind of coalition could be not imaginable because everybody has the highly interdependent economic relation with China. So nobody wants to gang up by those, four countries ganging up together vis-a-vis China. But now I think that there are, a remarkable amount of the interest that the four countries are sharing together, both geostrategic, geoeconomic, and also the maintaining the safety of the maritime order altogether, and those really makes us combine together. So we have organized a series of the summit meetings and ministerial meetings to agree with comprehensive agenda altogether. So we expect that India to be become much stronger strategic partner in the years to come. But at the same time, something that we need to remind ourselves is that India's, I think, the worldview and their strategic priorities still rest in the realizing of so-called multipolar world order. So probably that their inclination to the Quad cooperation is probably the part of their strategic interest they do have in elsewhere. And this is the reason why that India takes the very much nuanced position over the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And India is one of a few countries that have abstained from making a position on the UN General Assembly over the condemnation of the Russian invasion, because India has a substantial economic and military relation with Russia. They buy, I think, 60% of their military equipments are still coming from Russia. So they cannot really take the decisive, issue on decisive, posture on this Ukraine issue, and that really question, especially from the value perspective, how much that we can really share the value with India, especially that the fundamental the principles of the international relationship has been deteriorated by the act of Russia's, but India cannot take a firm stance on this. How can we really deal with the future Indo-Pacific problems? But I think we have to be very patient about what India can really do for this Indo-Pacific agenda for the future, because I think India has been really struggling with the current situation, and potentially that if India takes a more leaning towards the Indo-Pacific agenda in the years to come, we can expect that they will try to dilute the relation with Russia even more in the years to come. So this is something that we expect India to become in the year late 2020 to early 2030. And you also mentioned about immigration issue, and let me make a few points regarding Japan. Japan is quite a monolithic ethnic society. If you come to Japan, that you see a very kind of it's a not really complicated kind of ethnic structures that you can find in Japan, which makes us quite difficult to promote the robust immigration policy, even though that we suffer from the aging, society. Our workforce has been declined, and especially for their, the future of those the demand for the workforces in the critical structures. So there are lots of voices that we should relax our immigration policy, especially to invite those both high-skilled talents from many parts of the world, as well as those non-high skill, the low skill laborers to be working in Japan more flexibly. So these are, I think, the critical juncture that we Japanese society also need to go through those reform to become a much more relatively like a multi-ethnic society in the future. And interestingly, that those the parts of the country that need for the workforces are in the suburban side, known like a metropolitan size, where the conservative LDPs and those the conservative nature of the society still lingers, but those are definitely be in the need of those workforces. And there are many like Vietnamese, Indonesians working in the countryside of Japan. So probably the multi-ethnic culture can be generated from outside Tokyo than the inside Tokyo. Those are something interesting kind of changes that we see. And secondly, that also deal with our self-defense force. We cannot really fill those kind of the required the personal demands in the SDF. In that sense, I think the only idea we can pursue is to introduce the robotics, AIs, and those cutting edge technologies to be drastically adopted in the future defense posture of the SDF, something that we need to invest more on this field.
All right, thank you so much, Ken. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, John, for all of your comments today. Thank you all for attending. I know we could talk probably for several more days, but thankfully the folks in the room here today will be able to continue this conversation. And thank you to our folks online for being patient for our program today. We really thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the World Affairs Council and the Carnegie Mellon Modern Languages Department for their partnership. And thank you to NAJAS and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation for sponsoring this program. I think one of the main things that has come out of this for me is that we've seen how enormously complex and unexpected all of these strategic considerations and concerns are with competing interests, both within and without different nations. But, we have to keep raising our vision for the values of equality, of democracy, of working together for a peaceful future and having conversations like this one. Because again, if we don't share those interests, we're never going to get to the values conversations. And so, thank you again for being here, for underscoring why that's so important for us, today and in the future. So for those of you in the room, I hope you will continue to chat. We have a lot of good programs coming up. We have one more lecture for our Japan lecture series at the Japan America Society. Check out the World Affairs Council website for their upcoming programs. A lot of good ways to learn about the world from right here in Pittsburgh or from your computer screen. So again, I want to thank you all today for a great program, and we hope to see you again soon.